Good morning, everyone, online and here in this session room. My name is Victoria Granström. I'm a member of the Scientific Program Committee at SIWI. We are arranging this seminar together with co-conveners, and this is the third session of this session series within this seminar, What Sparks and Fuels Innovations in water, in financing water. So this is the third session in the seminar, and the first one was convened by World Bank and CAF, Latin American Development Bank. The second one was broadcasted online, Turning the Tide, together with Global Water Intelligence and Christopher Gasson. And this one, I want to welcome to you Scott Bryan from Imagine H2O, who is the co-convener of this session. So please, Scott, welcome.
Okay, we're going to hear a lot about sparking and fueling today, so just want to preface with that. Yeah, I think if you didn't see the earlier sessions, please go back and see them. On Sunday, we really opened with the magnitude of the gap and the financing that's going into water solutions today, and actually how few people that reaches in the broader context of things. So Saroj Jha from the World Bank really spoke to the number of people that the World Bank actually reaches through their financing each year. I think he had it in the 30 to 40 million people annually, yet we're trying to get to 600 million. So what needs to change? How do we create a pipeline of more fundable deals? Because there's capital ready to enter the space, but it needs to find a home. And clearly, centralized solutions, that's how you can reach the most people. That's how you can quickly get to scale. But they're clearly, if we're talking about using that analogy and the spark and the fire, well, there's places that the fire does not burn. And where are those gaps? And that's where the role of decentralized and distributed infrastructure can play an important role in serving those who live beyond the pipe. But also when we're thinking about resiliency and resilient systems, this issue of, can you have decentralized wastewater treatment or water reuse at scale, and how can that take off the burden off of municipalities if you've got industry embracing technologies like that? So that's really the context that we're going to have this discussion in, and why I'm here is from Imagine H2O. We really work with entrepreneurial solutions. We're a nonprofit organization that runs an accelerator and a pilot financing program for the best entrepreneurs in the world. Our entrepreneurs have collectively raised $1 billion in early stage financing to build their businesses, but that's mostly equity financing for that initial kind of build your team, build out the business. But that's just the start. That's the spark. Where's the fuel? So we want to get into a bit of, I want to share with you about how entrepreneurs are thinking about once they've built the prototype and their working solution, how do they then replicate that 1,000 or 1,000,000 times? And what kind of financial structures will they need to use? So that's a bit of why we've brought in the entrepreneurial interface today. Clearly, we can't capture all this in a 90-minute session. That's why there are investment conferences for water innovation. But I think it'll be interesting to get to kind of the messy parts of this and the complicated parts of financing decentralized solutions. But where are there opportunities and hope, and where are there opportunities to make structural changes? So we're going to start out with a session. I want to call up Leslie Porres from Global Water Partnership, who has a long career that spanned time at the World Bank to water.org and now Global Water Partnership, who's really been at the forefront of working with development finance in this space. So thank you.
That was a really nice introduction. I'm not sure I deserve all of it, but thank you. And it's a pleasure of mine to be here and discuss this topic, which is close to my heart, with several people who have been working very deeply in it. And we're going to really kick this off by exploring the role of multilateral development banks in providing that fuel after there has been a spark, right? So with that, I would like to invite the real speakers up to the stage. I just get to ask them questions. I guess I will invite both Joel and Jitendra to come sit here while I go ahead and introduce them. I'll start with, well, I'll let you sit first. I'll start first with Mr. Jitendra Singh. He is a water supply and sanitation specialist at the Asian Development Bank. He has 21 years of experience in planning, designing, and implementing water supply and sanitation projects. In addition to supporting project teams within the ADB, he also manages their Sanitation Financing Partnership Trust Fund. And I'll turn it over to Joel Kolker. He is many of a familiar face. He is the global lead for water and finance within the World Bank's global water practice. He leads the practice's global efforts to secure private financing to meet the enormous financing gap in the sector. He brings more than 35 years of experience in dealing with issues related to infrastructure finance across multiple different sectors. So, when we think about the challenges that are really facing innovating financing water, especially these decentralized solutions. And again, we think about and we think about this in the context of talking to a multilateral bank that's really probably focused on the large-scale infrastructural projects, right? That's what we think of. I'd like to hear from you in the experience that you bring to this table in this room and online. What are the foundational components that need to be present to attract greater private sector participation as well as public finance? Joel, will you kick us off?
Sure. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let me touch on a couple different things. First of all, the private sector is involved in the water sector. If you walk out the door and you look at most of the water-related infrastructure around Stockholm, much of that is funded by pension funds and insurance companies. That's the historic way that big infrastructure has been funded in the north, and that's the case around the globe. And we're seeing more and more of that in the south. Now we have different instruments. You've got public-private partnerships. You've got debt, including bonds and loans. We've used management contracts. We've also used microfinance around the world. So let's start with the premise that I don't think it's debatable that whether the private sector will come in. I think they are in, and they're in for the long haul. In some cases, we've seen water-related bonds that go out 100 years. So this is doable, it's possible. And we have to examine why is it happening in some places and not happening in another. And at the risk of repeating myself over and over and over again, and I apologize for this, I think it really comes down to why it is working in many places and not in others is two very fundamental things. And one in particular is quite critical to the private sector, so I'll stress that. The first is the efficiency of the providers. And we're blessed in the water and sanitation sector in that there are key performance indicators which really measure the viability and ultimately the bankability and the creditworthiness of the providers. And that's things like number of staff per 10,000 customers, non-revenue water, collection rates, energy-related costs. These are all things that you can look across the globe, and you can, we run something called IBNet, where you can look at different utilities and you can assess these key performance indicators. And the reality is that if you look at some of them, you can quickly assess whether a service provider, whether a utility or a local government, is actually viable. And that's very clear. And we need to do that kind of work all around the globe. The second one, which I do think is particularly relevant to private sector investment, is some ways the more difficult one, and that's the governance, policies, institutions, and regulatory environment. In other words, it's the playing field in which we operate, and it's as critical to the public sector and public sector investment as it is to private investors. So the risk of going on too long, that's really what it comes down to, the technical and financial efficiency of the operator and the policy, institution, and regulatory environment, and implementing that with integrity. It's not just enough to make laws or regulations, but they have to be implemented with integrity. Thanks.
Oof, you touched on a lot of things there that I would love to keep going on, but I would love to hear also from Jitendra and sort of your perspective, your experience, and the experience from within the Asian Development Bank as well.
So, from Asian Development Bank point of view, the region we are working in Asia and the Pacific, it is a general observation that most of the projects, we create assets. And when it comes to operation and maintenance, when the bank is not involved in the operation maintenance funding, then we find that there is a degradation, and the assets doesn't serve its purpose. And government is not really keeping all the time it's on priority that, okay, it needs to be funding in the way it is required to. And there we see a big gap, big opportunity for private sector to come in. But again, like Joel was saying, there is not enough ground for private sector to take interest in those projects, in operation maintenance, putting the money. So we have assessed and learned from the different projects, and we have found certain things like enabling environment, de-risk, and payment security, credit worthiness of the utilities. And on these factors, we have worked in background. So one of the things what we are doing right now is that we have prepared a standard contract template. And that contract template is taking care of KPIs, because there is no standard contract template at present in the market. So different projects have different KPIs, and assessment of the utilities is not standard. So bidders are not very much sure when they go actually for implementing and for working there, what kind of surprises they will get. So we are working in that direction, and we are hopeful that by end of this year, we are going to release one contract template, standard contract template in our DMCs where we are working. Yeah, thank you.
Taking notes, so I can come back to it later. When we think about this too, so the interplay, we've highlighted a lot of different risks, and actually I want to pick up on this whole idea of risk here, because this is about really sparking and supporting the innovation, right? Innovation is risky. I think a lot of us any of us who are involved in it, and whether you're thinking of it from a financial standpoint or reputational standpoint, or just, will it work, right? This is the risk. You could take that in so many different directions. However, we're looking at ways that multilateral development banks might be able to support innovation. Any kind of bank, most banks, I'll say, most banks are risk averse. So we're hoping that institutions that are risk averse will support things that are inherently risky. So how does a multilateral development bank really assist in this process of supporting the innovation to reach solutions in areas where maybe they're not perfectly situated to solve?
Yes.
Yeah, please, please.
So there are two major ways how we think of this issue. One is that we as ADB cannot provide small loans to MSMEs and the informal sector, which is serving the rural and people on the peri-urban areas, which are not part of the big projects. So we cannot provide small loans, but yes, we can provide loans to the intermediaries, like commercial banks, and they in turn can provide loans to the small MSMEs to flourish and to work there. Now, what is required there, like some technical assistance from our side to the banks to really become capable of assessing their MSMEs. Because usually what is the practice? They consider these MSMEs working in water and sanitation sector as very risky. Maybe they need to change their mindset and assess the values which they normally ignoring. That is one. And second is, what we are doing at present is that we find a gap in our approach, that we normally are not involved in assessing what are the innovations available which can help us to fill the gaps which is not happening through the larger projects. So in that scenario, we are supporting agencies, like for example, imagine H2O, Toilet Board Coalition. So we have understood that the way they are working, that is actually matching our requirement. For example, if you are working in a DMC, and we find that entire area is not being served through our water supply network, or there are some gaps in sewage sanitation, which is not meeting the objective of leaving no one behind, then we support this agency, like Imagine H2O, who are on their own bringing the innovations, trying, testing, and they are assessing the financial model as well, how it will sustain. So matching those proposals with our projects, with our project officers, how they are working and gap filling, we proceed. So like for example, one example is drink well in Bangladesh, which we are going to understand better more. Another example is like Bhumijo from Toilet Board Coalition. So these are how we are working in that direction. When we support through technical assistance to the agency, they go there, see the political environment, the willingness, the kind of regulatory environment there, which financial model will work for the innovation or not, and then based on that, we start doing that. So there are now only very few examples, but we hope to sustain and scale it up more. Thank you.
So I definitely agree that there are two kinds of risk mitigation out there. And I want to expand a little bit on what was just said. I think the first area of risk mitigation is around the financial environment that we operate. Now, the World Bank part of that I'm with only works with the sovereign, but we have a sister organization called the International Finance Corporation that only works with the private sector. And they are not the only player out there. There's lots of organizations, KfW, Propaco, many of you you're familiar with. But there's a number of instruments they have, and the creativity that comes out of those organizations is actually very impressive. It really comes down to they have instruments to provide debt, they have instruments to provide equity, they can look at guarantees, and they can use a host of different currencies and investment modalities and really tailor it to mitigate financial risk. Now, does it do away with financial risk? Absolutely not. But the idea is to help in the de-risking process, and there's a lot of creativity there, both in the public and private sector. I would even argue things like credit rating organizations are a mechanism of increasing transparency and therefore helping to increase knowledge and ultimately de-risk some of the financial implications of this. But I would also argue that the second part of this is kind of the legal and regulatory framework that's put in place. And these are the rules of the game. And this is really important to the private sector because if you're going to come in, you want to know what you can and cannot do. And you want it to be clear and transparent. And most of all, you want it to be implemented with integrity. And often this is where we get jammed up. We'll set up rules on who can be on a water board or how tariffs are increased or what the quality of water has to be, and it's written in a very clear and transparent mechanism. And then later, sometimes for good reasons, COVID was a very good reason, tariffs are suspended or reduced, quality issues come up because of flooding or droughts or other things. And that has a major implication on the investment side. It obviously impacts the public sector as well, and that's often where we tend to think the big impact is, but we have to recognize it's where the private sector is also affected. So for example, management contracts were quite popular in our sector a while ago now, and there were key performance indicators which dictated how people got paid. And you sign a contract, and in theory, you reached a key performance indicator, and you were due some money, and there were instances where there was some going back and looking at that. And that makes it very, very difficult for the private sector to operate. So I think 2 points. One really is there's the financial de-risking, and we spend a lot of time on that, but I've always found that's a very detailed conversation that is very impacted by what's going on in particular countries and even subnational jurisdictions. Some of the states and provinces we work in have different rules and regulations, and the financing really needs to be tailored to that. What's a little broader and sometimes underappreciated is the legal and regulatory framework in which we all operate in, and that's as important to the private sector as it is to the public sector. Thanks.
Thank you. And that aligns so much with things that we've been saying together for years now, but it's nice to have another way to look at it. With the few minutes that we do have left, and you've addressed this quite a bit, Joel, but just to sort of get some overarching thoughts, and it's actually a point that Jitendra made, and the fact that especially if you're working even from your side to sort of mobilize or trigger and spark these kind of things at a country or subnational level, how do we, and we think about the perception of investing in water SMEs is risky. Other than, you've mentioned, how do we, what other ways might we be able to really work on that issue, right? How can we convince the people who can lay the money out in the field that this isn't nearly as risky an environment or an investment as they would like to, as they currently think, right? And you've started, Joel, with definitely the different sort of ideas around that, but I'd welcome additional thoughts, especially around this SME component of it. Either you or Jitendra.
So, can you repeat the last question? Sorry.
What more could we do to really, if it's the lenders in country who are going to be lending to the SMEs, and right now they're reluctant because it's risky. How can we help reduce that? How can we remove or reduce that perception of risk with those national lenders?
Certainly. So what is happening? We should try to understand their perspective also, why there is a reluctance. And one of the reasons is that there are so many things happening, so many proposals coming to the government level, and when they will somehow try also and it doesn't work, that takes us back, all of us back, because they will never try again. So somehow we need to prove that. That is the first requirement of the government normally, that if it is proven how it is working and how much we have in, how much surety of the performance and all. So we have to somehow prove that. And for that only, I was telling that from ADB point of view, we try to provide technical assistance where it is not a burden on them to try that. And we also want to be sure that when we are providing this, we should not go back. And there comes the importance of the proof concept kind of thing, So that's why we help the innovators also to try in that environment and to assess whether they are going to really perform in or not. And that's the reason I'm not saying that we are going to cover our all DMCs and wherever the gaps. We are trying and testing in those environment where we find that it is going to be successful, nearly successful. Once that is done, that will pave the path for the other DMCs to adopt and customize as per their requirement. So that is the main philosophy, and that way we see that, okay, there is a step further.
Okay, thank you. Joel, do you have more?
Yeah, I think you mentioned the keyword customizing. So it's very easy to have this conversation and throw out generalities. I just want to recognize that, working with Aquila or Viola or Jacobs and bringing them into Manila in the Philippines is a very different experience than working with a drink well, bringing it into a secondary city in Bangladesh. It's not to say one is better or easier than the other. We just have to recognize that the instruments we have to be tailored very much to the environment we're working in. Second point I want to raise is there's always a lot of emphasis when we're talking about de-risking on the financial and not so much emphasis on the legal and regulatory side. And I want to just make some observations on that. There was a time in my life where I ran a guarantee facility, and I was always surprised that bringing in a project with a guarantee really didn't influence the price very much. It might get a project considered as opposed to it not getting considered without the guarantee. It might extend the tenor of the project, which would change the financing. It might increase the grace period on the principal, which was critical during the construction phase. But I was always surprised that it really didn't influence, in my experience, very much whether the interest rate was 10 or 8%. It really wasn't that blatant. So that's not to say this isn't important, but I always felt that the financial impact of de-risking sometimes was very overstated, while the ability to create a clear and transparent regulatory environment that everybody knew what the rules were, and there was confidence in the market that they were going to be implemented with integrity, was undervalued. And I've seen us try to do transactions where there wasn't a regulatory environment. Many of these projects get built under the premise that the provider is too big to fail. Now that may work in Nairobi or Manila or Jakarta, but we have a lot of clients in secondary cities and rural areas, and when they go in, the too big to fail scenario doesn't work. And what does work is knowing what the rules are and knowing that those rules are going to be implemented with integrity.
Thanks. I think that was perfect. I want to thank you both for really sharing these ideas and really elevating that, I especially feel very strongly about the governance aspect being under-discussed here, as you know. So really appreciate the thought that you are both demonstrating and sharing, and hopefully everyone is learning. With that, I will actually invite a model of what this SME and sort of experience can look like and how it can be fueled and how it can get to scale within a country environment by inviting Minaj Chowdhury to join us. Oh, were you showing the video first? Okay, sorry. If you don't know, Minaj Chowdhury is the CEO and co-founder of Drinkwell, an award-winning social enterprise that has deployed more than 500 decentralized water systems via public-private partnerships with utilities, municipalities, and public health engineering departments across Bangladesh and India. His work has been featured by The Economist, BBC, UNICEF, and the US State Department. He's a Fulbright, Echoing Green, and Ashoka Fellow, as well as a 2 times Forbes 30 Under 30 social entrepreneur. So Minaj. I'm gonna turn it over to you to share with us how you've been able to fuel and keep going and achieve such success.
Dhaka is one of the most densely populated cities in the world, at approximately 18 million people, of which 4 million people actually live in low-income communities. These are areas where you might not have access to legal, safe drinking water. At Drinkwell, what we do is partner with utilities to enable these low-income communities to have access to safe water through a network of water ATMs. Dhaka Wasa has over 700 pumps all across the city. It was only possible to operate at scale through a direct partnership with Wasa.
We have introduced so-called water ATM because we know what is the meaning of ATM machine. But now, if you put the card in the ATM machine, instead of money, water is coming up.
There's a caretaker who walks you through a pay-as-you-go system in which customers can get just as much water as they need.
And we introduced almost 100 water ATM machines, and we want to scale it up. Very soon, we are going to do 300 water ATM.
এই কার্জন আগে ছিল না, এখানে অনেক রাত পর্যন্ত আমি লাইনে দাঁড়াই থাকতাম। লাইনে দাঁড়াই থেকে পরে আমি পানি নেওয়া হইতো এবং এই পানি নিতে যে অনেক সময় মারামারি হইতো, অনেক ভিড় হইতো। আর এখন যেমন এই কার্ডটা এটিএম কার্ড হওয়ার পরে আমার কোনো ভিড় হয় না, যে কোনো সময় এসে আমি পানি নিয়ে যাই এখান থেকে।
পানি এটিএম গুলোতে আমাদের ভালো হয়েছে, মানে ফুটানো লাগে না, এখান থেকে নিয়ে আমরা বাসায় যেয়ে খাই ফেলাই। বাড়ি গাড়িগুলো মনে করেন আজকে আমাদের বাচ্চা স্কুলে দিয়ে এলাম, সময় হয়ে গেছে গা, তখন লাইনে খাওয়া জায়গা নিতে পারি না, আর এখন মনে করেন নিতে পারি, কোনো সমস্যা নাই এখন।
Drinkwell has been deploying water ATMs in partnership with the Dhaka Water and Sewage Authority, or Dhaka WASA, since 2017. Beyond Dhaka, Drinkwell has deployed water ATMs in Chittagong, Rajshahi, Faridpur, as well as arsenic-affected areas across the country. The water ATMs are deployed using a phase-based evaluate, design, build, operate approach, where phase 1 involves evaluating a Dhaka WASA pump house to assess the viability of the pump for an eventual water ATM. Upon completion of the site selection survey, the Drinkwell Quality Control Team collects raw water from the pump house to process a water quality test, the final step of the evaluate phase. After collecting the raw water, the quality control team tests the water at government-designated laboratories to eventually collect the test report. The raw water quality report informs the next phase, which is the design phase of the project, wherein which the water quality data informs the filtration system design as well as the civil structure of the water ATM. The water ATMs are installed based on the design developed by the civil engineering team. Anyone can become a water ATM customer by on-site registration at the water ATM booth. To become a customer, 2 passport-sized photos and a national ID card photocopy are required. Customers pay a one-time fee for a water ATM card and can top up on prepaid credit by loading pay-as-you-go credit onto the water ATM with a minimum of 10 taka to a maximum of 999 taka per recharge transaction. Upon registration, customers can easily collect water in a pay-as-you-go manner based on tariffs set by the water utility partner.
এই জিঙ্ক অয়েলের পানি অনেক ভালো আমাদের ঘরে কাজ করে ধন্যবাদ জিঙ্ক অয়েল
আমরা আগে লাইনের পানি খেতাম ওই পানি ফোটাতাম ফিল্টার করতাম দেন খাওয়ার জন্য উপযোগী ছিল এখন আমরা ড্রিঙ্ক অয়েল হওয়াতে এটিএম বুথের মাধ্যমে পানি নিচ্ছি ইজিভাবে নিচ্ছি এবং ভালো পানি পাচ্ছি আমরা অনেক হ্যাপি পানিটা পেয়ে থ্যাংক ইউ ড্রিঙ্ক অয়েল
To help customers with any questions, problems, or concerns, a Drinkwell customer hotline is staffed by Drinkwell service operations team who stand ready to ensure a delightful customer experience. Security of the water ATMs are ensured through a water ATM control center where all booths are monitored via 24/7 closed circuit cameras. Drinkwell's service operations team monitors and regularly analyzes sales, operational, and maintenance data to ensure quality.
That was like a 2018 video. So first of all, really exciting to be here. And I figured I'd start by sharing how I was born and raised in Dallas. So here's a map of the US. And it's actually showing the GDP contribution by city. And so if you look, the main drivers of economic productivity in the US are on the coasts. And so I went to college on the East Coast, and as I leaned into water as a passion, I found myself on one of either coast. And when I went to India to study arsenic, I found the same dynamic. You had the 4 corners of India. You had Calcutta, you had Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai. And what was fascinating was it was the same dynamics of urbanization, where if you wanted to figure out where the researchers were, if you wanted to find out where the best environment was just to have a decent life, it ended up being in these very densely packed cities. And I think, if you look at the literature, when low and middle income countries try to go to high income, the data says that urbanization is a necessity. And so when you look at Bangladesh, that massive mountain-looking thing in the middle is Dhaka. There's 20 million people in Dhaka, and it's literally like Everest because it falls off a cliff. And when we think about economic density, when we think about prosperity, when you think about producers being in close proximity, cost of scale efficiencies, you see urbanization being really the trend that continues. And I always feel like people compliment the lush greens of Bangladesh and the blue rivers of Bangladesh, but the country isn't really spreading itself thin. It's really further urbanizing. That's the power of urban. And what I see moving forward is they're going to lean even more into urbanizing. There's not going to be any de-urbanizing. And so that creates a lot of stress in the city infrastructure. So if you look at Dhaka, the city is actually managed by 9 different agencies, each who report to different ministries. So you got the mayor of Dhaka. If any of you guys have been to Dhaka, you'll know traffic is a real problem. But the mayor, for him to do anything about traffic, has to first go to the traffic controller, which is the police, who reports to the home ministry. You have to go to Rajuk, who does urban planning, which is under the Ministry of Housing and Public Works. You have to talk about the buses, which is run by the BRTC, the road transport, which is under the Ministry of Road Transport and Bridges. So what you have, and by the way, each of these don't report to the mayor. They report to their own ministers. So you have this bizarre, vertically integrated line ministry situation where the local government doesn't really have much sway in solving problems. The same can be said for WASA. In water, when there's issues with water access, the WASA MD doesn't really report to the mayor. The WASA MD reports to the local government, rural development minister. And so what you have there is state architecture being very complicated. And in my view, sovereign lenders like ADB and the World Bank give money to the sovereign, in my view, to improve state architecture. And sovereign lending is there to improve state capacity. But when I think about how you can actually reform state capacity, I think startups are the agents that can spark the innovation and effectively improve state capability, which is all in all the goal of the sovereign lenders to begin with. So if we double click on water, I'm going to give Joel credit, this is his slide. Basically, when you have the utilities having, so if I give the example of Dhaka, 2,000 people coming in every day, you have, according to an ADB report, 3.65 million out of the 20 million who live beyond the network. By 2024, ADB report says there'll be 4.6 million people who live beyond the pipe. What you have is a situation where there's almost a slippery slope, a downward spiral. So then the question is, how do you turn that around and make it an upward spiral? Focusing on operations, focusing on governance. I'll let Joel speak to that if he wants to later. This is out of my league, but what I will say, this is what sovereign lending is meant to do. What I've found, though, is startups can help with the KPIs that help with this turnaround in a pace that is much more rapid than any kind of long-term sovereign lending cycle. So if I take the case of Drinkwell, there were 2 KPIs I pitched to Dhaka WASA: non-revenue water and return on assets. Baseline scenario, you had all these water sharks all over the 800 pumps, illegally jerrying lines of water. That was non-revenue water. And they were selling the water illegally, so you were not getting to bill any of that water either. Those are the 2 KPIs I promise you, your utility can improve on if you partner with me. Governance, very important. So when we thought about how we pitched that, very straightforward, it was a management contract. Kind of like what Joel alluded to. There's clear KPIs based on which we get paid based on uptime. And so I won't go through the different nuances of PPP models, but the main takeaway here is we're not privatizing water. There is no portion of this that isn't controlled by the utility, from the tariff to the operating hours to the site selection. Everything is actually outlined in the contract with the utility. Now, I don't want to talk too much about Dhaka. We've actually now hit 300 ATMs. We did about 43 million liters last month in Dhaka. I want to talk about the secondary and tertiary cities that we've tried to work in since we had some success in Dhaka. And so I thought what would be best was to give a framework. This is actually, if any of you guys know Paul Graham, who's the founder of Y Combinator, a startup curve for entrepreneurs. I wanted to tailor it for water PPPs. And so at first, you have the MOU of optimism. So if I rewind to September 2018, SIWI, it was right here, at the World Bank Global Water Practice Task Team Leader Shoma, who's on the very left, through the Imagine H2O Urban Water Challenge Award, I got paired up with Shoma because she was just finishing a mega loan with Chittagong Wasa, where they had finished a mega treatment plant, but there were still pockets that were beyond the pipe. Fast forward 2 years, we deploy a pilot, we sign for a 100-system scale-up, and then we had the trough of sorrow, the crash of bureaucratic ineptitude. What happened was Chittagong Wasa agreed to provide 100 sites, but they themselves don't have more than 10 pumps themselves. They need to get permission from the city corporation. So you go back to that slide if you remember the vertically integrated mess. We had a situation where you had a new stakeholder who wanted some cash inflows from the project, but there was no space because it's a very lean operation. The utilities are giving us their land, they're giving us electricity, they're giving us their water connection. The margins are really thin. So then we try to get some wiggles of hope. And so it started off with, this is a photo of Ambassador Haas from the embassy, the US ambassador to Bangladesh. Through his advocacy, we received what's called the US State Department Award for Corporate Excellence. And thank you, subnational diplomacy. What ended up happening is there was an award ceremony, so Secretary Blinken's blessing created an opportunity for us to invite the local government minister and the secretary, who, remember, is who all the utility heads report to. And we pled our case. And we said, look, this is really promising, but we can't do this with WASAs. We need to work with city corporations. That's thankfully when ADB, oh, and then one more nuance. So this is the ADB life cycle of a sovereign lending project. So it's about 7 years. Phase two, so if I think about when I met Shoma in 2018 at SIWI, she was at the end of her project, so around step 11 and 12. I think that's why we missed that whole issue of the land not being owned by WASA but the city corporation long term. But in the ADB case, what happened was we were able to connect with ADB as they were in step 2 of feasibility, of scoping out the investment loan. And I think that's the perfect entry point for startups to begin engaging with the multilaterals. So what happened was through the Accelerating Innovation and Digitization Program, we were able to engage with Narayanganj City Corporation via ADB. And then we finally hit the promised land, which in our case is the state architecture agreeing to pilot more ATMs. So in March of this year, Narayanganj agreed to, through TA, have 5 pilots, which if they work, the investment loan would fund 50 ATMs. And we did a similar model with Kulnawasa, where ADB had just finished a project where if the pilot works, again, it'll be scaled up. And when we think about the state architecture, you keep coming back to the issue of the 7 different ministries. And so last month, what was really exciting was the Prime Minister has acknowledged the role startups can play in upgrading state capability. There was a startup summit where she herself acknowledges how quickly startups can move and directed the ministries to ensure innovations like Drinkwell can in fact scale up. So when we think about the journey of a sovereign lender versus our journey through the water PPP, I feel like the muscles are very similar, but at dramatically different magnitudes. But the time frame is actually very similar. 2018 to today, it's been about 6 years, which is the promised land. The next step for us is to have a bankable national cluster. So how do you get all the proceeds from Dhaka to offset some of the operating losses you may have up front with the tertiary cities, post which you can have it actually included in the national architecture of the state operation. And I think when I speak with task team leaders at the World Bank, project officers, specialists at ADB, the struggles are shared. It's the same target audience. We're all really catering to the same state actors. We just never really shared those struggles openly before. And I think what's really exciting, I'm looking at the audience, there's a lot of amazing supporters for Drinkwell's story that I see, grant funders, equity investors, debt providers. You know, Joel, one thing you said was, it's been 40 years and you haven't seen much change. But what I'd like to think is, if we look at all of the ecosystem enablers, accelerators, I think what they can do is be those intermediaries to help accelerate the ability for startups to align with the multilaterals in their sovereign lending journey. And I think that could be really exciting, because I don't think that was around 40 years ago. But now you have heads of state, now you have a mature ecosystem able to, I think, match, and hopefully that'll help accelerate this whole SDG 6 journey that we say we're very badly behind on. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I think that's a really fascinating way of hearing about it, first from the multilateral development banks, and then how it actually plays out in the ground at different points in time in the process. So, and I also just wanted to plug your point towards the end there around the high-level political will and support that is also needed or any political support to be able to push some of these innovations through. With that, I would love to return to Joel and Jitendra to sort of reflect on the points that Minhaj made and offer some of your own reflections about this kind of journey and the potential that he has also articulated.
So let me clarify the 40 years and nothing's changed, if I may. I think a lot has changed, okay? So let me take you through the journey, and 40 years sounds like a really long time, but it's actually kind of accurate. So I think, and particularly around private sector investment in water. So I think in the 80s and 90s, the world was very enamored with public-private partnerships, and these were big transactions. The most famous one out there is Manila Water. Transactions were tried in Jakarta, in Buenos Aires, in Dar es Salaam, smaller ones elsewhere around the world. And I think the approach going in, and there's plenty of blame around, I will take my fair share of this, but the plan, the thinking was, particularly in markets where the governance arrangements and the utilities and the providers were not very strong, that the private sector could come in and really kind of assume and deliver on the entire corporate responsibility around water. And except in a few places, that model did not work with some good reason, because it underestimated the role of the public sector and the need for governance and the legal and regulatory framework. Now, this is an enormous generalization and oversimplification, and people will point out places where it's worked, and Manila is a very good example, and there are a few others that I've been involved in that have continued on. They've changed and evolved over time, but I think that was very much the premise in the 80s and 90s. Again, PPPs still exist today, they're just very different. Many of them are affirmage instruments where the private provider does not bring the capital expenditure money, but we're getting into too many details. I think in the last 2 decades, we evolved into more of a financing approach. And this is what I pointed out earlier. You have de-risking in finance, and then you have legal and regulatory. I think the last 20 years, we very much focused on the financing, and we created funds. And I certainly created my fair share of funds with help of others and other people's money. But the reality is they haven't really dispersed. Now, there are some that have. Those that I've been most aligned with are in the private sector, actually, but a lot of public sector funds. And we're very happy when we raise $100 million and say we're going to put it into the water sector, or we're going to do we make all kinds of commitments, and these terms like blending and leveraging, and they get thrown around, and we love to talk about transactions. But for the most part, those funds really haven't dispersed, and that's the problem. So the supply of money is relatively easy to put together, and I use that somewhat tongue-in-cheek. They're not easy, but you identify a pension fund, you identify de-riskers or other things, and people are able to put together a fund, but we don't often have credit-worthy borrowers, and that's where we get jammed up. So I want to be optimistic, not pessimistic about the way forward, and I am optimistic about this. When you come out of talking to private sector, big private sector providers, they're not talking about money issues. They're really talking about creditworthiness providers. Same thing on the NGO community. People aren't talking about money. Now, some people call it working on the enabling environment, transforming systems change, foundations, system strengthening. And words do matter, and I think it's very confusing for our clients in utilities and local government. I think we have to get clarity on what it is we're talking about and clarity in terms of what we're doing. The beauty of this, and the reason I am particularly optimistic, is we know what works. On water and sanitation, if we focus on things like non-revenue water, which creates the assets to sell, which was one of the things you mentioned, and if we focus on energy costs, and then if we focus on collections, you can move from being a non-viable service provider to a creditworthy provider. And then you can tap into private capital, and you can work more creatively and innovatively with the private sector going forward. So it's been a journey. I don't mean to make it sound like it all failed in the past. We've learned valuable lessons. There have been some successes. But I think now we are very much at the point where we need to focus on this technical and financial efficiency, the governance arrangements, and really focus on these improvements that have a tremendous impact on service delivery. Thanks.
Wow, that was a lot. Thank you.
Sorry, I felt like I had to make up 40 years of failure.
No, 40 years of experience and insight helps all of us tremendously. Jitendra, what do you reflect?
I'll just take 2 minutes here. So when we were talking about the support to these agencies to bring the startups and innovations into the main projects, now I'll just take you to the other scenario, other example, which will correlate the picture. So in a project in India, which ADB was just formulating and processing a few months ago, we were discussing with the client the problem. Earlier there were days when they will come with the projects. You give the finance for this project. And they were not really keen to really discuss whether this project is really required or we want to, suggest them something else. But these days when we were discussing with them upstream, one of the requirements came, a city in Dehradun, Uttarakhand of India, if you're familiar, certain months of year, they have so many pilgrims walking through the city, going to hills and pilgrims. So suddenly huge influx and thereby waste. So they came up with this idea, we want to bring mobile toilets into the city as strategic points. And that is because they had seen the success in another part of the country, promoted and supported by another agency, but this is how it works. Now they had the appetite for experimenting in this one and making this part of loan. One example. Second one, prefabricated wastewater treatment plants. Again, same state, different city, which is a hilly city, and there was scattered population at 4 or 5 locations where conventional treatment plant connecting to is not possible. So there they were open to go for prefabricated wastewater treatment plants, which was not the case a few years ago because they were not very sure about the performance and all. So about the mobile toilets, they were keen to take put in the loan component so that capital is being taken care, and the toilet operation model was already established, successful, so they were going to sign the agreement like that. Prefabricated, they were taking as a part of loan. So this is coming from the, when they get a confidence in the innovation in startups. And third thing, last thing which I want to say is about sometimes they have the capability. They can go for, funding and take the loan and do in the main project, but they don't want to. And that is another good thing and hopeful thing. They say that they want to focus their resources in the things they are already doing. And another example was, again, from the Dehradun, and that is not something process that is under discussion, and that is the FSSM, fecal sludge management. So they told that this area is outskirts, though it is called urban, but it is not actually urban, it's very scattered population, thin density. So we want to do FSSM till the time there is a requirement for centralized sewer, but this time we want to be dependent on informal sector. And for that, we want to do something like, licensing the vendors and making something in the system so that it is better than at present it is. So these are the examples I'm talking about that, okay, if you support a little, doing due diligence, doing some assessment, then there is appetite, and then it works, it moves forward. Thank you so much. This is all.
Thanks for that. I'm sad, but we have to draw this component of today's conversation to a close and move on from the role of the multilateral development banks in cooperation with the innovation. But you will be able to hear from them later at the end of the session. So they're not completely gone, just for a moment. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Scott to take us to the next phase.
So we're going to be kind of working backwards in the Imagine H2O journey, but it's incredible to see our star alumni like Minaj reaching the promised land and Paul Graham's journey. Thank you for sharing that slide. But I think we're able to speak a little bit about what Imagine H2O's been able to do with partners like the World Bank on our WTAP program and ADB on the AID program, where we're able to actually fund pilots and help communities do things new. And oftentimes those communities don't have those budgets or the human capital to do that. This is part of a larger initiative at Imagine H2O to fund pilots. We've recently launched a partnership with the Coca-Cola Foundation, where we'll be funding pilots in the sustainable access area. We have our Urban Water Challenge, where we're funding pilots in major cities, and we've been actually celebrating those entrepreneurs throughout the week here at SIWI. So I want to bring up two entrepreneurs who are working on decentralized solutions, so you get a better sense of how they're financing their business right now. I think, again, moving backward, where are these new ideas coming from? What are the challenges that these entrepreneurs have in scaling their business? And I just wanted to give you all a brief flavor, so kind of a lightning round with two companies we're working with. So I'd like to call up the Ocean Oasis team, and then Jack from POW Water. Now, entrepreneurs are always ready to pitch an audience. We're not going to do full pitches today. I really want them to just briefly describe what their solution is and how they've financed their business to date, and then we'll get into the next phase. So just brief lightning round. Maybe Jack, if you want to start us off.
Sure. Thanks so much. I'm Jack Hartpence, co-founder, CEO at POW Water. And basically, we've built a decentralized and digital platform for ordering water in Nairobi, Kenya. To date, in terms of financing our business, I think we've had a lot of success early on in the grant world. The Gates Foundation was an early backer of ours through their Grand Challenges initiative. And that was awesome. And I think, that type of risk that they were willing to take on that, both with phase one and then ultimately phase two, was huge for us. And then equity financing. And so that's been mainly venture capitalists, family foundations, and angels out of America as well as Europe.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and share our perspectives. I'm CEO and co-founder of the Norwegian company Ocean Oasis, here with my co-founder and COO, Sebastian Femlet. We are developing technology for sustainable desalination of seawater using wave energy and floating offshore desalination buoys to run a conventional reverse osmosis desalination process and deliver desalinated water to water utilities in coastal areas. Initially, we've been funded by private investors. Our major investor is the Norwegian family office Grieg Maritime Group, a global player within shipping and ship owning. And we have seen in our funding journey that the combination of grant funding and equity capital has been very important. So that grant funding, first from national schemes in Norway, primarily Innovation Norway and the Research Council, and in Spain as well, we've had grant funding, that has been catalytic in bringing the right investors on board and de-risking our case for them early on when we're still in the early days of our technology development. And what we're doing is infrastructure, so it's capital intensive, so that support has been very important. And lastly, I'd like to mention EU support. A few years back, we got a yes from the European Commission, the EIC Accelerator, the European Innovation Council, for a blended finance solution with 2.5 million euros in grant funding for a project, a pilot project in Gran Canaria, where we're currently piloting our full-scale test system offshore, which is quite exciting. And we also have a pre-commitment through the European Investment Bank EIC fund for an equity investment up to 6 million when we are proceeding and are preparing for scaling.
Bear with me, I realize that these solutions are all a bit disjointed as far as what we're presenting this morning, but I wanted to give you a flavor of how they're raising capital. In the water sector alone, each year we're seeing about 400 million in venture funds flowing into the space. That's about 1% of all climate tech deals. So as far as venture capital in water, the number is quite small. We're excited to see new forms of non-dilutive financing coming online, and it's great to see entrepreneurs like this raising money from foundations and national endowments. So there's a lot that needs to be done. Venture capital will not solve everything in water. Helge Dabel's here from Emerald, who we'll bring into the discussion here. But it certainly plays an important role, and I think those numbers speak to kind of the temperature in the water innovation space. So, but that's equity to help you build the business. But that's the spark. Now let's think about the fuel. If you were to think out into the future and you were going to be serving a much larger portion of Nairobi or moving on to other cities, or you were talking about deploying 1,000 of your buoys, what kind of institutions and lending mechanisms might you be approaching, and how do you foresee that happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think undoubtedly with water, you need to diversify out of just venture. I think venture plays a big role for us, and it will for a very long time. But I think one thing that we're working on right now is a kind of a strategic partnership around machine learning and artificial intelligence with the U.S. government, and we see that type of thing continuing to be very important as we scale. And so that could be organizations like DFC, that could be organizations like the bank, et cetera, that will need to bring in additional streams of capital. I think for me, one thing I look at in terms of, you hear the word de-risk a lot. But I think one thing I love about Imagine H2O is by accelerating startups and really giving them a platform to show proof of concept and scale up, in a way we're de-risking the entire water space. And that's so important. If you look at industries far and wide, I think water is one that maybe has more of a lack of innovation over the last 20, 30 years. And I think we're going to see that begin to change. And I think a big part of that is going to be driven by startups. And startups need a platform to be able to do that. And I think Imagine H2O does a good job of getting people's names out there.
Just taking on your de-risking approach, and I think it's important to kind of break the two sides of the risk. One side is the financial side of it, and I totally agree. And I think it's traditional instruments we're basically using, similar as energy before, structuring project finance with creditworthiness as a big part of it. Then you need to have a creditworthy off-taker and help them to be creditworthy and to be able to sell water to them in basically water purchase agreements and in the long term. So that's part of it, and I think that's a lot of work in that side. The other side is the risk perception from the off-taker and the government. And that's the risk we are tackling with piloting and getting together with them. And I think that was important in our previous phase, where the first pilot brought us to the next pilot. The off-taker understood our value, and the off-taker saw that it's real, it works, and they can take it with us. And with that structure, where they don't face paying that much capex, because we're structuring in a way that where the banks and the other institutions allowed us to do it, we still need to get the off-taker and the government and the institutions to agree on all those past, and I really like the whole structure of who's taking the decision in the government. How we do that, we need to have feet on the ground, be able to showcase and be able to de-risk for them our technology. It's not the technology being used, and for them it's something totally new, and the risk, it's higher perceived than the reality. So piloting in that case, and even if you have the technology proven in a different place, you need to pilot in a new place so they can see that that works.
And just adding on that, I think the point of de-risking it for the earliest adopters of new technologies, and then going also country by country for those earliest adopters is very important. So looking ahead now, we have teamed up with one of the large water utilities in Gran Canaria in Spain. Spain is the largest market for desalinated water in Europe. That water utility already has an existing desalination facility running, but they need to increase capacity, and that has proven to be very difficult for them. So what we're now doing in a partnership is going together to seek funding and also grant funding to deploy a fleet of our desalination buoys out of the coast of the north of Gran Canaria to allow them to actually increase capacity on their existing facility. So it's through a partnership with the water utility.
A lot of times we see great ideas in water coming from outside space. Do you look to other spaces like energy, for example, for models of financial innovation that would be applicable to your businesses?
You know, just the water PPA. It's basically a PPA structure. Yeah, and it's way easier, especially to talking with banks and financial institutions, talking about a PPA from energy. Yeah. And it's okay. This is similar. There's a lot of nuances to it, but they understand it. They see how it works. They have a proof of how it works, and it makes everything easier, at least to explain it. So we're really structuring in a similar way, doing infrastructure that is required to a lot of capex at the beginning, then long term with lower operation and maintenance costs. We can do that, and we really use that similarities to deploy. Sometimes it's tricky because we are doing both in a way, because we're using energy to design it. We're not using any external source of energy, but so we are using wave power to do that. So sometimes we lie in between both of them. We need to be very clear where we are delivering water.
Yeah, I think for us it's the same thing. I mean, we're a decentralized platform, so we take a lot from energy. Many of our investors actually have experience in energy investing as well through a decentralized approach. So yeah, and also you know, pay-as-you-go models, right? I mean, I think that's something that's super interesting that you can learn a lot from existing incumbents that have done a really good job. There's a company in Africa, M-Copa, that we take a lot of inspiration from.
Great. Well, I think that's it, unless any of you had anything else you wanted to add, but we'll go from there.
No, thank you.
All right, thank you. And now I'll call up Ashton to introduce our next speaker.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It's going to be a short one. I didn't think you'd call me to the stage. I would like to introduce Gilbert Guma. He's from Uganda. He works for an organization called water.org. He's a consultant there, so he's one of the only abstract that we accepted for this session. So just like you to take us through, you know, one of the innovative financing models that you use in Uganda. You know, how do you finance startups, and what has your organization done? So if you can just in 2 to 5 minutes, just share that with us. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's not very easy to speak last because the concepts are touched here and there. Thank you for the warm introduction. I'm Guma Gilbert, and I work for water.org. I am basically here to drill in on proof of concept of working with enterprises under water and sanitation. Water.org has been in this space for over 30 years. However, with several learnings, we've been able to understand that our niche would definitely be development financing. The proof of concept here is in working with financial institutions, microfinance institutions, to draw as much capital as we can to support at the local level. I know a lot has been said about the ease or the difficulty of upstream capital flowing. However, we're also looking at the downstream capital, capital that is supposed to be mobilized from the financial institutions themselves. So in the proof of concept, and I've had a lot of de-risk talk here, the proof of concept within, for us, marries that very aspect in that we work with specific financial institutions to drill out a model and work with them for several years to see that, one, there is product integration of water and sanitation. Short of that, financial institutions have quite a number of priorities to support. So without specific product integration of water and sanitation within their business streams, probably a lot would get lost in there. So we do quite a lot, one, in doing market studies with financial institutions, supporting them in developing their MIS systems so that specifically water and sanitation sits in there. That is very crucial for us. Without sitting in there, it would, again, get lost in a lot. When you ask the typical financial institution, the biggest portion of their capital or their portfolio, they'll tell you it goes to business, but what business is it? So this is where we come in to strongly profile water and sanitation as business. You know, for a long time, we've had water as a public good. And so this is a change frame we're trying to create, a mindset change in our environment in Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, to be able, one, to understand for the financial institutions that water is not just a public good, but it is business. I mean, look at us here. Probably if you looked at each one of us here, we must have taken a cup of cold water this morning before we came, or a cup of warm water. So this is strong business. There is a business case in there. So, but for a long time, even the institutions, the microfinance institutions, the banks, have not looked at it that way. I mean, water was to whom it may concern. We did a landscape study recently, last year, and we realized there were quite a number of players in the space of water and sanitation, and doing it haphazardly, uninformed, without specific KYC trailing of what was being done, schools, water service utilities, doing a lot of work. But when they come and approach the bank for borrowing, for example, they do not come as the water facility. They come as an individual. So we are losing out on a business case that would provide sense for more capital injection in that sense. So we are trying one, what we call the water credit model, where banks take on water as a loan product, and they are able to lend it out specifically and track it as a product, so that then we can be able to say, yes, we have reached this number of people, this amount of capital has been able to be mobilized, and these kinds of investments have been reached. So I will invite you to East Africa, and I know this water credit model is not just in East Africa, it is in Asia, it is in LATAM. And so we're trying out to see that we scale, specifically speaking to the subject in the room around enterprises. Our focus is that we want to marry a long-term journey between enterprises and the financial institutions at that level, so that at that level they are able to speak into one another. One, the financial institutions probably have gaps around understanding water and sanitation. This is not a specific thematic area for them. So our technical assistance program supports that very area to see that they quite have a greater understanding of what water and sanitation, and interest them in going out to these enterprises. On the other hand, from the supply side, the enterprises, as has already been said, are quite struggling in a number of areas. One, bankability has been mentioned. That is an area we are strongly looking into to support them through partnering and linking with incubators, accelerators that can grow their profiles so that, well, they become credit worthy. The other aspect, again, has been marrying the whole environment. I know for most of us and for Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, water has been the sole provision of government. And in a sense, there is a lot required in marrying the different facets, pillars, that would support this kind of proof of concept. One, the Ministry, for example, of Water and Environment in any government is basically looking at public utilities, and the private utilities are out there struggling. The Ministry of Finance and central banks are regulating the financial institutions, and they are not entirely looking at the KPIs that would support the social performance of these financial institutions. So marrying these two elements in terms of them speaking to one another and having guidance at that level would be very helpful, which we are doing to ensure that, well, the financial institutions have comfort and the boldness to then reach out to the enterprises in water and sanitation rather than wait for the usual business they know how to do. So I will repeat, one of the things, as I conclude, I know I was given a few minutes, the proof of concept is very critical in the future of water and sanitation and financing. Water.org has chosen this path to specifically work for several years with financial institutions, microfinance institutions that critically understand what water and sanitation is at that level. It could go as far as employing loan officers who have an understanding of water and sanitation at that level. We've seen this work in our communities, in our governments, at the agriculture level. We've seen central banks that introduce agriculture facilities, but we've not seen a lot around water and sanitation. So that advocacy in the environment is quite very profound and required for us to move forward, to gain mileage. Otherwise, as we have all said, the capital will be available, but the burn rate for this capital may not necessarily be there because of the lack of proof of concept. De-risking is not just in providing guarantees, but it is in working with financial institutions to understand the business of enterprises, how they do it. The aftermath effects would be the efficiency, but to start with, we need to bring enterprises on board by incubating them, accelerating them understanding what they need to do in terms of providing the service. Then the financial institutions also come in terms of understanding how to position themselves. So the bank worthiness for the enterprises and then technical assistance to the financial institutions is quite very important in scaling access to water and sanitation in our communities. Thank you.
Musical chairs, but we want to get to some of the questions that were posed to us online and then get some discussion going. We've got just less than 11 minutes. So Victoria, would you like to get to our online questions? Yeah.
If we can have, yes, perfect. Thank you. So the first question is, how did you deal with water sharks operated?
We made them operators. Was the easy. It didn't always work. We gave them a shot. Some of them were more compliant than others. So that's the first thing, is whoever you're disintermediating, don't completely, take their lunch. give them some dignified way out. But it required, we had the Home Minister inaugurate an ATM. We had multiple members of parliament have to inaugurate ATMs. We had to get WASA to get security. We've had employees who have been threatened. There's been issues. It has not been easy.
Solutions.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That was the only question for you, Minhai. And then we have one question for Joel. And it might be a little bit trickier. And it is about guarantees. They have different terms, and some of them might be too short and expensive for SMEs. So could you elaborate a little bit about the terms and also the different types of companies that need the finance?
Sure. There's a variety of companies that provide guarantees. There's within the donor community, you have all the major multilateral development banks. A lot of the bilateral donors provide guarantees, but there's also private sector guarantees that are available. Depends on the business you're in, depends on the country environment, depends on the economy. So it's very hard. It's actually an easy question because I can't really answer it because there's so many variables. But it's worth shopping for sure. There are some manuals that are out naming the different organizations that provide these guarantees, and it's worth looking at those too. But there's specialized groups. There's some in certain countries that kind of tailor themselves to the businesses from that particular country. So it's really varied, but they're out there, and it can be structured to do all kinds of different things. Tenor extensions, as you mentioned, they can help mitigate some payments during the construction phase. I think I mentioned that earlier. So shop, be very clear in what you're asking, and be very flexible in terms of what you can receive, because often if you're working with a good partner, they'll come back to you and they may say, we can't do this, but what about this? And they'll look at different options. So I hope that answers the question, or some of it.
Yes, but I have a follow-up question.
Here, I thought I was off the hook.
When you are working in the different countries, do you promote different solutions of guarantees and length of the terms?
I think we promote different product. Well, let me correct myself. We don't promote anything. I think the key is you have to listen first, and that's quite key. What's the problem that you're being approached with? And I think it's worth pointing out, often the problem that you think you're dealing with is not the problem. So spend some time investigating the problem and figure out what it really is. And then picking up on the last point, make sure you tailor the solution to what the problem is. I think we've learned we don't always know best. There are clients, there are providers, there are community members who really understand the situation. You've got to listen to them. You have to understand what the issue is. Sometimes it's not a guarantee problem. I mean, the most successful transaction I've ever done in my entire career, the World Bank has not put a dime of money into. It was conversations that we had, and we were able to really push the transactions along. It ended up in 3 different loans at about $75 million in total, totally driven by the entity, but really kind of opening up that space and creativity. They didn't need a guarantee. That's the best kind of guarantee, one that you don't need, and really learning how to do that and listen and assess what the problem is. I hope that answers.
Yes, thank you. You are off the hook.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Joel.
Are there any audience questions? Maybe we need online needs to be able to hear it.
Okay, that's good. Yep.
Yes, thanks so much for organizing this fantastic session. My name is Lisa, and I'm an entrepreneur empowering households to purify their own water at the household level in Indonesia and Kenya. Mr. Joel, and Mr. from the Asian Development Bank. Yesterday, I heard Mr. Oswar Chanda of the African Development Bank making a statement that the return of investment on a pipe from a water utility is 50 years. At the same time, in Indonesia, 8 million children are stunted and thousands of people die of diarrhea. So, also in Indonesia, the report of the World Bank, Vision Towards 2045, showed that only 9% of the population is using water from a water utility on a day-to-day basis. 9% only, which means 91% depend on self-supply. They use their own well. Even in my house in Bandung, which has like 4 million people, I am connected to a water utility, but I use a well because there's no water coming through that water utility. So how do you see your contribution to help Indonesia and Kenya and so many other countries reach SDG 6, but ensuring that those 91% that depend on a well can also have access to safe drinking water? That would be my question. And would you be willing to also look beyond investment in water utilities? Because if they only serve 9%, like, how equal is that? This is what my question is. And yeah, I know there's no clear answer on that, but
Joel, or?
Well, there's a whole,
yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
There's a whole conference there. Look, I think there's several factors. The goal is not to have the service providers only serve 9%. That's where we are today. In general, you have two options of service providers, public or private. The point I was making earlier, even if you go to a private operator, and many countries use that model, there is a role for the public sector in terms of overseeing and managing, and that's the role, that's the kind of support that we would provide in that. Often the private sector no longer provides the resources for the capital expenditures, and that's another role that we've been asked to play before. So I don't disagree with the scenario that you've laid out, but I think the solution is definitely has opportunities for both the legal and regulatory side of this as well as the financing side that are going to be quite critical. So the goal is to certainly safely manage both water and sanitation so that we have universal access. And that's the Indonesian government and the Kenyan government's goal. That's not us as individuals.
JK, would you add anything? No, okay. Okay. All right. Yeah, we've got just over a minute left, so very quick, George.
My name is George Kibalabauer. I'm with the GSMA Digital Utilities Program, and we work across energy, water, sanitation, and waste management. Have been proud supporters of Drinkwell and as well Bumijo. It was great, Minhaj, to see your slides on collaborating with the public sector. Resonates a lot with a recent toolkit we put out on how startups in the utilities ecosystem can work effectively with the public sector. But what I wanted to touch on are 3 points during the discussion. One is how to bring in local financial institutions, lessons from other sectors, and then pay-as-you-go as well, and how that's all related. So a huge driver in the growth of the off-grid solar ecosystem across Africa and Asia has been the ability of that ecosystem to access local currency financing, debt financing at favorable rates. And there are different structures such as receivables financing structures that could allow small-scale decentralized water service providers to access debt in local currency at scale. So I'm wondering how can startups, but also the DFIs work better with the local banking sector and bring them in, understand the sector better, but also use opportunities like as pay-as-you-go to showcase a transaction history which can then be used as collateral for future loans. An enterprise like Drinkwell has now a long-standing digitized transaction history that it can showcase to banks and financial institutions solution. And Jack from Power Water also touched on innovations in pay-as-you-go in East Africa. So yeah, how can we bring the local banking sector in more? I know that there are institutions like Accra for All already working on that in East Africa, but would love to learn more on that.
Unfortunately, we're over time, so that's a question for the fika afterward. But thanks to everyone for being here today.
Thank you to all our co-conveners and all our participants in the panel, the startups, and of course, Imagine H2O hosting this session. So thank you everyone, and please join the online and watch the online session from yesterday. Thank you.